My name is Stephen Pointer, and I have the honor of serving as the education curator here at the Holocaust Memorial Resource and Education Center. I stand here with you today to remember the Holocaust. But tonight, we ask that we remember and reflect a little more than usual. And perhaps most importantly, we remember and we reflect collectively as a worldwide community. On November 1st, 2005, the United Nations designated January 27th as International Holocaust Remembrance Day to commemorate the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau and to remember one of the most horrific crimes of our time, the systematic killing of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, and millions of others by the Nazis and their collaborators. We pledge that we will never forget. We vow to tell their stories and to honor them by defending everyone's right to live with dignity in a just and peaceful world. 77 years ago, the liberation of the death camps ended the carnage and horrified the world as the full scope of the Nazis' crimes became apparent. Out of this horror, the United Nations was created to bring countries together for peace and our common humanity and to prevent any repetition of such crimes against humanity. The resurgence of hatred in our world, from violent extremism to attacks on places of worship, shows that anti-Semitism and other forms of religious bigotry and racism and prejudice are still very much with us today. But just as hatred persists, so must our resolve to fight it. Today and every day, we commemorate the victims of the Holocaust by pursuing truth, remembrance, and education, and building peace and justice in our world. I'd like to quote Elie Wiesel from a speech in 2001 in a Days of Remembrance event in Washington, D.C. How does one mourn for 6 million people who died? How many candles must one light? How many prayers does one recite? Do we know how to remember the victims? They left us without a trace, and we are their trace. This fiery memory remains, and we, you and I, and all of us are its very privileged custodians. I'd like to welcome to the stage Rabbi David Kaye. Rabbi Kaye was ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary in America in 2002, where he also received a master's degree in Jewish education. He served Congregation Ohev Shalom in Maitland from 2004 until 2021. Rabbi Kaye is a member of the Jewish Community Relations Council of the Jewish Federation of Greater Orlando, the Orlando Mayor's Council of Clergy, the Orlando Mayor Dr. King's Martin Luther King Jr.'s Commission. He also is the current chair of the Interfaith Council of Central Florida. Rabbi Kaye, welcome to the stage.
Thank you, and it is an honor to be here. When we think of the Holocaust, we usually don't think of music. But there is a collection of songs from the ghettos and from the camps and from the partisans that you can find on the website of the United States Holocaust Museum. These songs were often about hope and about defiance and about resistance. But the authors had to code their words so prisoners would understand, but the guards and the soldiers would not. This song I want to share with you is from the Birkenau concentration camp, a forced labor camp in northern Germany. It consisted of 10 barracks of 100 people each, political prisoners, including gays and lesbians, Jehovah's Witnesses, communists, social democrats, and of course, many Jews. The labor that was done was called land reclamation. But what that really means is they went out early every morning to the moors, dug trenches, and harvested peat for fuel. There are no recorded murders in the Birkenau concentration camp, but there are many, many cases recorded of physical and psychological abuse and brutality. Jews, of course, were particularly targeted. When the SS controlled the camp, they would force Jews to hand clean latrines on Shabbat, on Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Kippur. The song is called Die Moorsoldaten, or the Moor Soldiers. It was written in August 1933 for a prisoner show and almost immediately banned because of the final verse, which says, "Winter will not last forever, and happily we will once again say, my homeland is again my own." The song was smuggled out, written on the back of a photograph. It was picked up by the International Brigades for the Spanish Civil War, and is a marching song still used today by the French Foreign Legion. The English version, one of many languages into which it's been translated, is the Peatbog Soldiers, a favorite song that Pete Seeger did in concert. And it was recorded and performed by many Irish folk music groups. The chorus is very simple. In German, wir sind die Moorsoldaten und ziehen mit den Spaten ins Moor. We are the Moor soldiers, and we march with our spades into the moor. I invite you to join me in that chorus. It comes around a few times. Wohin auch das Auge blicket, Moor und Heide nur ringsum. Vogelsang uns nicht erquicket, Eichen stehen kahl und hoch. Wir sind die Moorsoldaten und ziehen mit den Spaten ins Moor. Wir sind die Moorsoldaten und ziehen mit den Spaten ins Moor. Hier in diese Ödenheide ist das Lager aufgebaut, wo wir fern von jeder Freude in der Stachelbahn verstaut. Wir sind die Moorsoldaten und ziehen mit den Spaten ins Moor. Wir sind die Moorsoldaten und ziehen mit den Spaten ins Moor. Wogen ziehen die Kolonnen in das Moor zur Arbeit hin, gaben bei dem Brand der Sonne, doch zur Heimat steht der Sieg. Wir sind die Moorsoldaten und ziehen mit den Spaten ins Moor. Wir sind die Moorsoldaten und ziehen mit den Spaten ins Moor. Heimwärts geht zu den Eltern Weib und Kind. Manche muss ein Seufzer kennen, weil wir hier gefangen sind. Wir sind die Moorsoldaten und ziehen mit den Spaten ins Moor. Wir sind die Moorsoldaten und ziehen mit den Spaten ins Moor. Auf und wieder gehen die Posten, keiner kann hindurch. Glück wird nur das Leben kosten, vielfach ist und säumt die Burg. Wir sind die Moorsoldaten und ziehen mit den Spaten ins Moor. Wir sind die Moorsoldaten und ziehen mit den Spaten ins Moor. Now listen to that final verse, and the chorus changed at the end. Und dann ziehen wir die Soldaten, nicht mehr mit den Spaten. Then will the Peatbog Soldiers no more march to the moors with their spades. Doch für uns gibt es kein Klagen, ewig kann's nicht Winter sein. Einmal werden froh wir sagen, Heimat, du bist wieder mein. Many of you here may already know Professor Abe Pizam. For those who don't, he is the founding dean of the Rosen College of Hospitality Management at the University of Central Florida. He continues to serve as professor and as Linda Chapin Eminent Scholar Chair in Tourism Management. He is widely accomplished in his field, having spoken in over 30 countries and authored more than 250 publications. Today, we learn another side of Abe's story, his story as a Holocaust. His journey to our community began in Romania, where he attended a secular school to avoid persecution under Ion Antonescu, who was a great admirer and ally of Adolf Hitler. After the war, when Romania was under Soviet control, his family was able to leave on a Haganah ship to the British Mandate for Palestine. But their ship was intercepted by the British and all the passengers detained in Cyprus until the modern state of Israel was founded in May of 1948. After receiving degrees in Israel and the US and a PhD from Cornell University, he taught at Tel Aviv University and the University of Massachusetts before being recruited by the University of Central Florida to create the Rosen School. Until tonight, Abe has only shared his story with his family and his grandchildren's classmates. And today, we are privileged to be among the first to hear his story publicly. Abe will be joined tonight by his family, who will ask him questions about how his experience in the Holocaust impacted on his life here in America, his perspective on life, and his hope for the future. We will then invite the audience to ask questions of their own. I am now deeply honored to introduce to you to our speakers for this evening, Abe Pizam and his daughter Judy, and his grandsons, Josh and Ash.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Judy Pizam, and I am the very proud daughter of our illustrious guest speaker, Dr. Abraham Pizam, known as Abe. Thank you for joining us on this special occasion. We are joined by these, well, they're going to kill me saying that, very handsome young gentlemen. This is Asher, my nephew, and Josh, my son. And they are here very honored to tell you the truth, like seriously honored. We want to be part of sharing my dad's life journey with everybody because it is quite a spectacular journey. And many of you know my dad as an academic, as somebody that is a mentor, a visionary, a tenacious survivor. But I think that the most extraordinary thing about my dad is that he's actually very humble, he's very loyal, kind, true, unconditionally loving, funny, and just a very gentle.
So Saba, why did you decide to share your life story now at 85 years old?
Thank you for that question. It's very important. For many years, I thought that my experience belongs in the past and that the future will be totally different. That people would have learned from our terrible experience and will not keep silent, because silence is actually adding anti-Semitism, adding bigotry, and adding prejudice. So I realized sooner than later that this is not the case, that unfortunately, despite that we live in a country that is supposed to be equal to all, that is supposed to provide freedom of religion to every single citizen, this is not the case. The events that happened in the last few months, as a matter of fact, even 2 years, showed that I was wrong. And at that point, I decided it is time for me to share. So this will never happen again. Because my mission in life is to educate those people who are not really familiar, who are denying that the Holocaust ever happened or minimize it. And my mission right now is to show them that it did happen. It happened on a large scale, but it happened also on a personal scale. And I'm one of those who have been impacted by that.
Oh, by the way, when they say Saba, that means grandpa in Hebrew.
Thank you for the information right there. I'm sure we all are very appreciative for that. So now that you have that given information, Saba, can you please tell us what life was like growing up in Romania filled with anti-Semitism and cruelty?
So let me start by that I was born in April 1937. At that time, Romania was under the dictatorship of Ion Antonescu, that Rabbi Kaye mentioned. He was an admirer of Hitler, on top of his titles as marshal, because he was a marshal in the Romanian army. On top of that, he chose to add a title of the Romanian equivalent of Führer, a leader. And he was called at that time conductor, which the Romanian language means the leader. He adored Adolf Hitler, and he brought Romania into World War II as a partner in the Axis. So anti-Semitism that already happened in Romania before his time was emboldened and increased tremendously. My parents were afraid to us because they saw what was happening around other cities and places in Romania. You all know me by the name of Abraham, which I'm very, very proud to carry, but actually that was not my birth name. My birth name that I was registered in the Romanian authority was Armin, A-R-M-I-N. Armin is a German name for a folk hero, a hero in the army of Germany many hundreds of years ago. They thought that by giving me a non-Jewish name, I will be spared all the discrimination and all the prejudice and other violent things that I went through. Unfortunately, they were wrong, because at the time, we had to carry the yellow star. So no matter what my name was, it was Armin, I still had to carry the yellow star, and people also recognized me as being Jewish, and I was, of course, discriminated and bullied by the rest of the kids. Furthermore, my family decided that I should not go to a Hebrew school, which we had a Hebrew school in my town, again for the same reason, that they were afraid that we will be attacked by the mob and I will be hurt. So they sent me to public school among the other kids who were Christians, but obviously that did not help either. And last but not least, I didn't give up, or they didn't give up, my Jewish education. So instead of being educated in a Hebrew school, they hired a tutor, and I studied the Tanakh, the Bible, from the age of 4 or 5, when I was able to learn Hebrew and to read the Bible. That was the beginning of my life in Romania. One other reason why I didn't share that story until now in public, because I did not think that my fate was so terrible as compared to the rest of my family or the rest of the Jews both in Romania and outside Romania. Because through a miracle, our family in the Jewish community in the city of Baku, where I was born and raised, did not end up in Transnistria, which was a large concentration camp in the border of Romania, where 280,000 people ended up dead. The reason why I survived that was that the Jewish leadership in our town bribed the officials, and when the German army and the Gestapo came into town and they asked the mayor, are there any Jews in town? He replied, no, we're Jews free. So that's why I was saved, and that's why my family was saved and be able to be here with you. Without that bribe, I would have ended like many of the others in Transnistria, if not shipped to Auschwitz or to other camps in Germany and Poland. So that is the reason I did not share my story with the public, because I thought, compared to my aunt, my father's sister, who married a Polish Jew before I was even born, they moved to Poland, and they were, of course, captured, sent to Auschwitz, and they never came back. So compared to them, my fate was much easier. So I thought, what right do I have to share my story when my story is not as harsh as theirs? And the truth of the matter is that compared to others, we survived, and we did not have the terrible things that happened. Nevertheless, as I am summarizing this part, I was ridiculed. I was called names, derogatory names. In Romanian, there is a derogatory name for the Roma people, the Gypsies, who are called Tsigan, and the Jews were called Zhidan. And I was painted on my back, on my coat, the word Zhidan. So on the back, you had the word Zhidan, and on the front, there was the Star of David, the yellow Star of David. So basically, everybody had the license to beat me up or to call me names. And despite the fact that I had no inkling, especially in my early days, when I was 4 or 5 or 6, of why am I being singled out, that nevertheless gave me a lesson very soon that we Jews are totally different than the others, and the Christians at that time have a license to do whatever they want with us. So that is the story. But the most horrific things that happened to me, which I have to share here, is that when I was 8 years old, as the war was, ending down, when I was 8 years old, my father asked me to join him to go to the cemetery, and I had no idea why that is. When I arrived at the cemetery, my father pointed to a coffin, and he said, "I want you to see what's in that coffin." So he opened the coffin, and in the coffin were brick-sized soap that were inscribed with the acronym R for Rheiness, J for Jüdische, and F for fat, which means pure Jewish fat. So that was the most terrible experience that I had in my childhood, when I learned that, according to my father and other people who buried that in the cemetery and said Kaddish, that soap was made of Jewish corpse. Now, I want to clarify that many years later, when the war committee investigated all the crimes, they reached the conclusion that actually that was not true, that the acronym was the acronym of an agency of fat, because during the World War II, there was a shortage of fat. And therefore, the acronym were not for reines jüdische Fat, but for the name of that agency. But of course, we didn't know that. When my father buried that, and when the community said Kaddish, we thought these were soaps made of Jewish bodies. So that was my horrific experience, which I never forgot, even to this day. And I also learned that the Gestapo used that rumor, which was a rumor, in order to scare people, in order to make those who cooperated with them even more cooperative. So in a sense, yes, it was not made of human bodies, but we thought it was, and we hope, of course, we mourned about it.
How did anti-Semitism affect you as a person?
Well, as a child, I did not understand. Why should we be singled out? What did we do wrong? Why are people hating us? Why are people killing us? We're just peaceful people going about our own daily life, and suddenly we're told that we're the scum of the earth, that we have to be eliminated. Why do they do that to us? That was obviously very impactful on my life as a child. Later on, I must admit that I met some people who survived, and they were saying, look, if that is what God permitted to do to his chosen people, we no longer believe in Judaism. We no longer believe in God. We realize that God abandoned us. So instead of me joining them in this belief, that just emboldened me, because I believe that the word chosen, which in Hebrew means nivhar, has several synonyms. One of those synonyms is muvhar, which means elite or prime. I studied the Bible all my life, and especially I studied Isaiah 49, in which God says to his people that they are chosen to be what he called the light unto the nations, the messenger of God, the moral Spencer of God. Therefore, I realized we have a mission here, the Jewish people in the world, and we were chosen by God to be his messenger. And as you know, throughout the history, those in power who didn't like the message killed the messengers. And that's exactly what happened to the Jewish people. We were the messengers of God. The other nations, some other nations didn't like our message, and they killed us for it. But in the final analysis, as a Jewish person, I have to admit that God made us a promise to return us to the promised land, and he kept the promise. We were returned to the promised land. Everything that he promised, he kept, and we are now more resilient. And we are now trying to teach the rest of the nations how to be the moral compass, how to be ethical, and how to treat others.
How did you escape Romania?
When the Russians invaded Romania after the war, they turned it into a communist state. Romania became communist. And overnight, all private property was sent to the state. So it was abolished, and we had a store, and my father was and my mother were storekeepers. So overnight, we became poor. We did not have a means to support ourselves. Furthermore, they changed the currency in Romania, and for every old currency, like 1,000 old currency, we got one new currency. So suddenly we became poor. And despite the fact that the USSR was responsible for, liberating many camps and, bringing down with the rest of the Allies, the Nazi Empire, despite that, they were themselves anti-Semites. Lenin, by the way, had Jewish blood. His grandmother was Jewish. Lenin never admitted it. And Stalin and all the others who came after him never admitted it. And they treated Jewish people not as fierce as the Nazi did, but nevertheless discriminated. So my father was a Zionist for many, many years. And when we realized that there is no future for us here, he decided to immigrate to what was at the time Palestine. And we boarded a ship. We moved from Romania to Bulgaria, where we boarded a ship that was a Haganah ship called the Jewish State. We boarded it and we intended to come illegally into Palestine because the British controlled Palestine. They had a mandate on Palestine and they did not want to disturb, so-called, the balance between the Jews and the Arabs. So therefore, they banned any Jews from coming into Palestine. So they found our ship, a British frigate found our ship. We were boarded by the British seamen. We were transported to their ship and from there taken to Cyprus, where I spent 12 months of my life in an internment camp. So imagine the Jews who were with us, who just came out of concentration camp and tried to enter peacefully Palestine. Now they went into British internment camps. So it was a terrible condition that obviously we encountered. And I will never forget my days on the ship or when we were boarded and later on when we lived for a whole year under barbed wires with submachine guns and all the other, weaponry, just for wanting to start a new life in our promised land.
Was there anything you managed to bring from Romania to the promised land?
When I was a young boy, my family bought me an accordion. And they gave me the accordion to keep when we were trying to enter Palestine. But when we were boarded by the British ship, they forced me to give up the accordion. And despite the fact that I tried to resist that and not give them the accordion, they took it by force. And because I resisted it so fiercely, the British seamen who took it away from me suspected that there was something wrong with that accordion. And when they opened it, they found in it $20,000 US, which was all our fortune that we were trying to bring to Palestine at that time. So not only did I lose my accordion, but my family lost all their possession. So when we came to Israel, we had nothing, absolute zero. We started a life. My father had to go back to an occupation that he learned many, many years ago and never practiced, to be an electrician. So that's how we came into Israel, penniless, but with great hope and admiration for those who fought the British and those who managed to declare our state of Israel.
How did you feel when your family made it to Israel?
Oh, I felt great. I felt this is where I belong. This is my forefathers' land, and this is where I belong, and this is where I will bring up my children and my family. And I married in Israel, and my wife is here, Esther, and of course, my children are here as well. We met Judy, but next to my wife sits my son. I'm proud to be his father. Kaye, the name of in Hebrew means life, and both of them were born in Israel. Both of them are proud Jews, and later on we came to America in the hope, I finished my degrees here, in the hope that this will be a land where we can practice our religion and our freedom without fear of persecution. But the last couple of years taught me otherwise. The last couple of years taught me that despite everything that this country was set up for, there is anti-Semitism, there is bigotry, there is prejudice, and on a very high level. And unless we all speak out, unless we all stand out for what we believe and say, we will not take it, we will fight it. My belief is simply that this whole thing starts with ignorance. Ignorance brings bigotry. Bigotry brings prejudice. Prejudice brings persecution, and persecution ends up in violence and genocide. So our mission, as it was put in the Bible, is to educate and be the light unto the nations, to educate people as to what happened. Because today it is the Jews, tomorrow maybe the African Americans, the after tomorrow the Hispanics, Asian, and so on and so forth. And unless somebody stands up and says, no more, we will not tolerate that, silence will kill us all. And this is the lesson that I wanted my children, and especially my grandchildren, to learn from me. And I will give you a personal example of what the ignorance can lead to. I was in New York and studying at NYU. I studied at night, during the day I worked. So one of my colleagues at work was a Catholic who recently came from Spain, and her name was Maria. So one day I come back after lunch, and I said to Maria, you know, it must be Ash Wednesday. I knew what Ash Wednesday was. So I said, it must be Ash Wednesday because I see a lot of people who have a dark spot on their brow. So she said, of course it's Ash Wednesday. What kind of Christian you are that you don't know it for sure and you ask me? So I said to her, Maria, I'm not a Christian, I am Jewish. And she turned around, touched my head. She said, oh, where are your horns? So unbelievable. I asked her, what do you mean by horn? She said, Jews have horns, and the horns indicate the devil. So you are part of the devil. So I said, I can't believe it. What are you basing it? So she said, have you ever seen a picture of Michelangelo Moses? And I said, yes, I have. And true enough, Michelangelo Moses has a couple of horns on his head. Now, what is this due? This is due to the ignorance of those people who translated the Bible from Hebrew into Greek and later on into other languages. Because it is said in the Hebrew Bible that when Moses came down from the mountain after speaking with God, his had an aura. Now, the aura is race. Now, the word in Hebrew for race is the same word as for horn. It is carried. So instead of translating it in race, they translated it in horns. And hundreds of generations were brought up to believe that Jews have horns, that this is, and horns symbolize the devil. So this starts with minor things like that, which is ignorance, and then goes into bigotry and all the rest until it reaches genocide. So as I said before, my mission now in life is to educate everybody, Jews or non-Jews, to see the truth and understand what a simple big lie can have an impact of killing 6 million Jews.
How did the Holocaust experience your life? Oh, so sorry. How did the Holocaust impact your life today?
Well, I am a survivor of the Holocaust. If things would have turned in a different situation, I would not be here with you, neither would my children and grandchildren be with you. I was among the luckiest ones. I was saved. So obviously it impacted my life because I was bullied, I was discriminated, I was prejudiced, but in a sense, I am the lucky one. My rest of the family, especially my family father, did not survive and they never came. So how did it have an impact on my life? It had a terrible impact on my life, realizing that no matter what country I am in, it's still I'm going to be a minority. I'm still going to be discriminated by some, and I'm still going to have a hard time. And I became resilient, and I educated my children and grandchildren to be proud of their heritage and make sure that this never, ever happens again.
Lastly, Saba, what do you hope for our life and our future?
Well, I hope my prediction, my dark prediction as a pessimist will never come true. I hope that the world will learn from our terrible experience, and I hope that this was the last genocide in our lifetime. I'm saying I hope, and this is a hope, but reality is quite different. And when I see on television a march of whatever, call them terrorists, saying Jews will not replace us, when I hear on the news that a book on the Holocaust was banned, I remember those days when the Nazi burned all the books that were written by the Jews or that mentioned Judaism. So my hope is for a better life for you than for me, but I am guardedly optimistic, and I hope that all of us will stand up to do the right thing. And when I heard after the war the excuses of the war criminals, I shuddered. Each one who was accused of atrocities against Jews and other minorities came up with the excuse, I followed orders. Well, my mission to you is don't follow orders if they are the wrong ones. If they go against your ethical beliefs, your religious belief, you have the right and the obligation to stand up and say, no, I will not do that. That is not right. And if the German people as a whole would have stood up at the time and sent a message to Hitler and his henchmen that this is not right, the Holocaust would never have happened. And the same thing is here in the United States. We have a mission. Our mission is to show to the rest of the country to stand up for those from the right and from the left, because they are both, and say never again, because today is the Jews, tomorrow is everybody else. Thank you.
Is there anything you'd like to add?
All of you. So we're gonna have some time for questions and answers. Some of you got cards and pens in the beginning, so if you have a question, now is the time. You see Kathy, Stephen, there's a couple other, Shelley is in the back, a couple other staff, Jen. You can pass your cards to them. I'm gonna get us started with a question, but before that, I did just want to mention, it's really wonderful that we have Josh and Asher and Judy here today, because for International Holocaust Day is a national day, and the theme this year is actually intergenerational remembrance. So it's really perfect that we have 3 generations here to tell their story together. So thank you again for coming. So the first question that I wanted to ask you while we get some more questions in, and then we're actually going to go to our virtual group because we have a lot of folks on the virtual program as well. But I wanted to ask you, did you or your family know what was going on outside of your community to other Jews at the time?
Absolutely. Absolutely, we knew. We lived in fear because the cities around us, the towns around us, the Germans entered, they found Jewish people there, and they deported them immediately to Transnistria, the least. And if not Transnistria, they put them in wagons and deported them to Auschwitz-Birkenau and many others in Poland and even in Dachau, Germany. So we knew that. And you all read the Anna Frank story about living in fear in one little room. We lived in fear in an apartment. It was not one single room, an apartment. And every day we were thinking, will the mayor and the politician keep their words and not squeal on us? Because they were bribed, as I said before, but we were not sure that once the Germans came into town, and by the way, the ones who came into town were not the Wehrmacht, which is the army, they were the Gestapo, which is the worst. So we thought they may scare the mayor and the rest of the politicians, and they may admit in the articles. So the answer to your question is we lived in fear until we left Romania, and even a little bit before, until it was invaded by the USSR.
We're going to go to the virtual group. So Lauren's going to ask a question on their behalf.
Good evening, and we've had almost 160 individuals watching tonight online. Actually, 175, I should say. One of the questions comes from Susan Flower, who asks, were you and your family given assistance once you reached Palestine to help you get started on your new lives?
Yes and no. We were resilient. We received mostly from the Joint Committee, Jewish Committee of United States. We were given packages. We had food packages, the same food packages that were delivered to us in Cyprus. So we were given that, but we were given also significant armament from the United States, and you could not believe from who else, from what it used to be Czechoslovakia. When I joined the Israeli army, we still had rifles that were made in Czechoslovakia, which was one of the first countries that after the establishment of the State of Israel supplied us with armament. So we were given assistance.
All right, so we have another question from the audience. Did you ever get another accordion, and if so, do you blame?
Oh, never again. Never again. I was so shocked and so upset that, which is a shame. I should have, but I couldn't, and I doubt that my parents had the means when we arrived in Israel to buy me another accordion.
So a question from the audience is, did you ever come in contact with non-Jewish resistance individuals or groups during your time?
No, I did not come. I knew and just met another person whose parents, whose father actually was in the US Air Force and bombarded Romania when we were still there and part of the Axis. But I never had the pleasure of meeting any of those. However, when the Russians came into Romania, a lot of them claimed that they are the liberators, that they are the ones who cared for the Jewish people and liberated us from, the terrible situation we were in. But outside of those soldiers that we met, I never met anybody else who was a liberator.
Quick question we got also. You mentioned that you experienced a lot of anti-Semitism while you were in school. Did you have any good moments in school or any friends that stood up for you or protected you?
The only friends I had in the Romanian school with other Jews that were there as well. I did not have any non-Jewish friend because they would not be allowed by their parents to mix with people like us. That's how they would put it. You don't make friends with people like them. So who are the people like them? In Romania, the stratification was that, the royalty comes on top. Next to the royalties are, the people who have the money. And at the bottom of the scale, you have the Jews, and below the Jews, you have the Roma people who are the gypsies. So you don't mix the message that the parents send to their children. You don't mix with these undesirables. So for them, we were undesirable. And that's what scared us the most. And you can't blame the kids because that's how they were educated. That's the message they got from their parents.
Oh, I don't have a microphone, but I'm loud. Oh, there it is. So we have a couple of, I'm sorting the questions since we have a lot that are similar, but we had a couple of questions about, did you ever reconnect with family that you got separated from, or did you ever go back to your hometown?
Yes, many, many years later, I went on a trip with my wife to Romania, and it was a memory lane, and I visited the town that I was born. I looked at the town, at the house that I grew up in, and the same is for my wife Esther, who also was born in Romania, but lived in a different town, and she also had a memory lane trip. But my disappointment is still with the Romanians of today. Despite the fact that young Antonescu was tried for treason after the war and executed, and despite the fact that Romania has today a law that prohibits any public space to be named after a war criminal, despite that fact, one of the largest cities in Romania, the port city of Constanța, has a couple of streets named after Antonescu. So when they were interviewed by the media, by the US media or European media, they were asked, why are they doing that? And they said, well, Antonescu was not so bad. And we think that he did a lot of good things, so we want to memorialize him. So in other words, despite everything that happens, they still adore and name streets after one of the worst dictators in the country of Romania.
Abe, can you briefly share how you and your family arrived to the US and what that was like?
Okay, so I came several times to the US. The first time I came to the US when I was studying towards my master's degree, and I told you the story about meeting that lady Maria who worked alongside with me. So that was the first time I came to the US. I completed my study and went back to Israel immediately. I was employed there by an Institute of Productivity. And at the Institute, I met an American expert in productivity that we became friends. And at the end of his term of 6 months in Israel, he asked me why I don't study further towards my PhD degree. And I explained to him that by that time I was already married and I had Judy. So it would be difficult for me to go back to the same life that I had as a master's student, to work during the day and go at night to school. So he said, no, if you are admitted as a PhD student in a good American university, then you will not have to work. You will be a teaching assistant or research assistant. And he encouraged me to apply for a university in the States, which I did. I applied to Cornell and I was accepted at Cornell. And my daughter was already alive at that time. So my wife and me and my daughter lived in Ithaca, New York. And that's how I came to the US for the second time. The third time, which was interesting, and I'll share with you a very small story, is when I was approached, I was in the States later on, I came as a professor to join University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And one of my friends found out that there is a position for a new department head to establish a Department of Hospitality Management. So I applied for that position and I got it. So the interesting story is about Mr. Rosen. So what happened is that after the newspaper announced that UCF is starting a new program in hospitality management, and I was recruited to be the chair, I got a call from a person who identified himself as Harris Rosen, a small hotelier in town. And at the time, he was a small hotelier. So he said to me, Abe, I want you to come to my office and tell me about your plans. So I found out that his office was in one of the hotels that he owns. So I went to the front desk and I asked for Mr. Rosen. So the front desk clerk told me, we don't have a Mr. Rosen here. So I said, is Mr. Rosen the owner of that hotel? And they said, yes, but he doesn't have an office here. So I turned around and I was on my way to go back to my office. But on the way, I found a housekeeper who was pushing a cart and she barely spoke English. So I told her, Mr. Rosen. She took me by the hand and she brought me to a guest room. And I thought, oh my God, she misunderstood me. There is a guest by the name of Mr. Rosen, and she took me there. But I had no choice, so I knocked on the door. And Harris opened the door, and he said to me, are you Abe? I said, yes, I am. And he said, you passed the test. So I said, what test was that? He said, I was testing to see if you were intelligent enough to find my office without, the front office telling you. Because I instructed them not to tell you what my office is. So that's my long relationship with a dear friend, Harris Rosen. At the end of that meeting, he barely knew me. he took a check of $10,000 and gave it to me. And he said, this is one of many checks that I will give you in the future. Please distribute it among 10 worthy students. And that partnership and that friendship bloomed over the years, and the 10,000 became 18 million when we built the Rosen College of Hospitality.
Mr. Rosen is indeed a very generous contributor and philanthropist in our community. We're grateful to have him in Central Florida. I do have a question from Josh online. He's asking, what does it feel like for you personally to now come forward and tell your story publicly? And then are you in touch with any other survivors?
It's a great relief. Finally, I am relieved. I can share my story and I can try to educate others to make sure that it never happens again. So it is a relief. I met many survivors, including Tess Wise, and I was impressed by their stories. And I said, compared to them, I was the lucky one. God smiled on me and spared me. But hearing those stories from their side breaks my heart even today, of what they had to go through and what has happened to me and how lucky I was.
So I have a question from the audience for Josh, Asher, and Judy, actually. So how has Abe's story or your grandfather's story impacted you in your lives?
Very proud being the grandson of the straight man. It has inspired me a lot to tell my generation about the story my grandfather told me. It means a lot to me, and I hope my kids will tell their generation about the story too.
I don't have much to say other than like.
He's just a very special, unique, unusual, phenomenal man who is kind of very loved.
Okay, so we have time for a couple more, but Abe, we've already spoken with Abe, and he has graciously agreed to answer any questions that don't get answered tonight. Later, and we'll follow us through email. So one question I have to ask is from an 8-year-old in the audience, and they asked, were you scared?
Yes. Yes, I was. And you can that we knew and we interacted with, and they disappeared overnight, and we knew where they went. So we were in constant fear. When I first read Anna Frank book, I realized how much I have in common with her, that she shared her feelings. I never did, obviously, write a book on my experience and share my feelings, but they were very, very similar to her, because my family and myself, my sister, a month or a few weeks, changed side and joined the Allied. So it is constant fear that I lived as a child.
So Judy, this is another question for you. So what did you know about your father's story growing up, and how were you able to ask him to tell you more of his story, and when did that happen? Did that take a long time, or were you able to have that open conversation?
So I'm very lucky because both of my parents are the most open, honest human beings you will ever meet. So there are really no secrets. So it's always been a very open communication, always asking questions. Dad, what happened here? Dad, what happened there? Mom, what happened? My dad, as you know, he loves to talk and he loves to communicate and to share. So it really was just him always just telling the story that he's always been doing it, the same thing with the grandkids. Just anytime we're together, he shares it and tells. So it was never a secret, dark secret, and it was just part of our life. And like you said, we were very lucky because we didn't have horrific kind of stories like some people did. So we were very grateful, and I was very grateful, and I was very proud. I'm like, oh my God, you're such a survivor. So that's kind of how I felt. Did I answer the question? Yes. Okay. We have another.
We have a question. We have several education groups online with us. And so we have some questions coming from some of our students who are watching. And the students are asking what you think young people can do to stop genocide happening in other parts of the world or even here today. And the second part of that question is, did you have a mentor or something that has kept you going on the hardest days?
The first question, what can you do? Stand up for what's right. Never be silent when you hear or see something wrong. Because as I said before, silence is an enemy. Silence allows genocide to happen. Silence allowed the horrific Holocaust to happen. So as a young man, don't automatically assume that if the adults are saying this is okay, and if you think it's not, speak up. This is a free country. We are blessed to have the freedom of speech, and that comes with the responsibility. And regardless of what your age is, if you are a teen or you are even in your early age and you see something wrong, speak up. And that is my message to all the new generation forever. Now, I did not have a particular mentor, but I had numerous educators especially in my elementary, in high school in Israel, who were also survivors of the genocide and established evening school because I could not afford in Israel at the time, high school had to be paid. You had to pay. And I could not afford, my family did not have the resources. So I ended up going to a night school. And the person who established that night school in the city where I grew up, which is Haifa, was himself a survivor of the Holocaust. So we heard the stories again and again and again from the principal, that person who established, and his wife. So no matter what subject we were studying, where we were studying geography, or we were studying social science, or even science, the Holocaust always came up as a subject. And obviously it had a great impact on me in Israel.
This is for Josh and Asher. So I know we were talking about how this is the first time that Abe has shared his story publicly, but he did share his story with his grandchildren's school. So I'm wondering, what was that experience like for you, sharing your grandfather's story with your classmates?
Let me put it this way, okay? I was absolutely terrified. I was embarrassed for him and myself. And the second he started talking, I'm like, oh my goodness, he has this in the bag. Like, I don't know if you can tell, as my mom stated, he loves to talk. I didn't know how much until he started to, but he had it in the bag. And like, I could see the people's faces. They're like, okay then. They were very shocked, and I was shocked because obviously I heard the story, but I never knew like how amazing it truly was.
And didn't like the kids tell you afterwards how that impacted their life?
Yeah,
What they learned and that they didn't know?
half the people I didn't even know listened or watched it, but it just randomly while going down the hall to next class, I see somebody I haven't met before, and they're like, your grandfather had an amazing speech, and how it changed my life in some ways. And I was like, thank you very much. My name's Josh, by the way. But thank you. And I just, I hope that answered the question.
As you can see, I'm the talker, but he's the comedian.
A question online? We have a couple more, and we got permission to extend the question section. So here's one about your family. So what ended up happening to your parents and your sister?
Okay, so unfortunately, my father died 5 years after coming to Israel. I was at the age of 15 at that time, and the rest of my childhood and teenhood, if you can call it teenhood, I was raised by my mother. My mother was a single parent, but very, very strong, and she fortunately died at a very old age, so I managed to enjoy my life with her. Unfortunately, after she died a few years later, my sister died, and I remained the only one of my family. Now, I do have family in Israel, a remote family, cousins. Most of those people are rabbis. They are from Chabad, one of the religious communities in Israel. And I am considered by them as the black sheep. The one who did not follow in the footsteps of my great-grandfather and the rest of the community. But I failed to mention that I was raised in what I call a modern Orthodox family. My parents kept strict kosher, and my father took me to the synagogue every Friday and every Saturday. And when my father died, I went every day to the synagogue and said Kaddish, which is a prayer for the dead. So I kept the tradition. But over the years, I became less and less religious. As my cousins would say, I became a goy. Which, by the way, in Hebrew, it doesn't mean what it Yiddish means. In Hebrew, goy means nation. And this is the right translation of the word. None of them were sent from our town. None of them were sent to the concentration camps because of the bribe. I must say that the mayor and the rest of the politicians kept their words. And when the Gestapo came into town, they said, even in German, Judenfrei, which means free of Jews. So we were spared, all of us, because every Jew in our community, pitched in and paid a certain amount, and that was collected by my father and then given to the mayor and the politician, and they kept their word.
So, one final question. So as a result of all that you've seen and all that you've witnessed and knowing what you know about our world today and what's going on,
Guardedly optimistic. However, this can happen here, believe it or not. Looking at the news, looking what happens right now as we speak, looking at what happens in our country with both the right and the left, becoming more and more anti-Semitic, I start questioning my hope, and I hope that I'm wrong, and I wish that I'm wrong, but the news are not encouraging. Let me put it mildly.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you again for all of your questions. We're actually going to invite Rabbi Kaye back up to stage. She's going to lead us in a memorial prayer. And the Pizams are actually going to head off for the moment, but will rejoin us for the candle lighting ceremony. So we'll give them a moment since the stage is a little dangerous here.
We ask you please to rise for Yom Rachamim, the traditional memorial prayer. Sachsenhausen, liberated on April 22nd, 1945, by Polish forces under Soviet command. We learn in the book of Proverbs that flame of the divine is the soul of a human being. I invite you to observe a minute of silence in memory of all of the souls. May we learn the lesson that they taught us today so that it happens truly never again. Holocaust Memorial Research Education.
Good evening, and as the rabbi said, I'm Shelley Lawton. I have the unbelievable honor of serving as the interim CEO of the Holocaust Center. So on behalf of Monty Starr, our board president, our board and staff at the center, we thank all of you, those in the audience here with us tonight and online, for sharing this day of remembrance with us. We are so honored that you took this time with us tonight. And Dr. Pizam, if I could ask you and your family to stand for just one moment, please. Dr. Pizam and family, the stories that you told us tonight about how this event affected generations of your family. We are so honored and grateful that you took this time and this place to tell your story. And we pledge to you from this day forward that our community and this organization will do all we can to tell your story for future generations. Audience, please join me once again to say thank you to Abe and his family. Rabbi Kaye, thank you. Thank you for sharing your voice and the power to this, in this day and age, most critical event, helping guide us in reflecting on our power and as a community to remember and seek ways we can individually and collectively ensure that we confront hatred in many forms that we see exist today. Audience, once again, please join me in thanking the Rabbi. And of course, if you don't mind, I need to take a minute to say that without critical community sponsors, events like this could not happen. So audience, once again, would you join me in thanking 3 of those very important sponsors: the Florida Division of Arts and Culture, United Arts of Central Florida, and the Arts and Cultural Affairs Department of Orange County. Thank you. It's the mission of the center and the future Museum of Hope and Humanity to ensure, to use the stories like we heard tonight, and the lessons of the to build a just and caring community. If you are interested in engaging with youth at our center, we have some of them listed in your program tonight. Please join us in educating our most. This concludes tonight's, take some time to gather around, look at some of our new events, and please come back and join us again. Good night, and thank you very much.